Hi, everybody. Hopefully, you're not sick and you're able to enjoy this time off. If you are sick, I hope you feel better soon. And if you're not sick, like I said, enjoy. But just a reminder, our test will be on Monday and Tuesday. And this very brief lecture is going to focus on science and culture during the Age of Realism. The objectives of this lesson include number one, to explain Marxist theory and evaluate the growth of socialism. Two, to link the realist movement with political and economic trends during the mid 19th century. And three, discuss and debate the impact of Darwinism. One of the most important 19th century thinkers that will have a profound impact on global politics in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century was Karl Marx. Karl Marx, along with his partner Friedrich Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto and published it in 1848. The ideas of the Communist Manifesto were central to the ideas later on of the Russian Revolution and the communist movement of the 20th century. Marx's central thesis was that class conflict had defined history. For example, back during the medieval era, the classes that would have conflicted would have been the nobles versus the serfs. In the 19th century, those classes would have been the proletariat, a word used to describe the working class, those that did the labor, versus the capitalists, those that owned the businesses, also called industrialists, perhaps bourgeoisie, or middle class, but that these two classes eventually would conflict and lead to violent revolution. Marx also argued that labor was really the source of all wealth, and that labor and property were the central structural devices of human existence. A worker was defined by his or her labor. And these injustices between the propertied bourgeoisie and the property-less proletariat led to the exploitation of the laborers. These ideas will help inspire later radicalism of the 19th century and would be central to the theory of communism. The theory itself called for a violent revolution, that the workers would rise up and overthrow the proletariat, and it would spread and be a worldwide revolution. Ultimately, after the revolution was successful, there would actually be no need for government. Government would be eliminated because everyone would be equal and share in the abundance of society. When I say share in the abundance of society, one of the other central theses, central beliefs of Marx and Engels was that there would be no property, no private property. All property would be owned publicly and shared, and the wealth would be equal, an equal division amongst the people. One other aspect of Marxism that later on scared many people, especially in the late 19th and 20th century, was atheism. This idea that religion was superstitious, and what we're going to see, especially in the 20th century United States, the largely middle class United States will be very nervous about ideas of violent revolution, ideas of atheism, and this will contribute to both the Red Scare in both the 1920s and the 1950s. One other impact in the 19th century of this communist movement, communism, by the way, is a form of socialism, and it's going to be the growth of what's called the Socialist International. It was especially after 1871, a rapid growth of different socialist parties. They had united first in 1864, and we'll see this continue on the development of the different socialist type parties. On the political spectrum, communism would be probably to the far left within the socialist movement itself. Art and literature during the middle 19th century was defined by what's called realism. And realism, for the most part, replaced romanticism in the arts. It rejected those idealized values. But realism also confronted the alienation of modern society and reflected the disillusionment many felt with modern life. Some of the writers included Gustave Flaubert, who wrote his well-known novel Madame Bovary. He was actually put on trial for obscenity and violating public morality. Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace. Charles Dickens' works, to me, are the most reflective of this period. And finally, many would call Zola a realist. I think the textbook calls him uh, the textbook does not call him a realist, but if you were to put him in the realist category, those of you who read German novel, that would actually be fine. My advice is to pick two of these authors and then pick one work from each author that you can describe to use for evidence in a type of a short answer question or an essay if you were to write about realism. The two artists that I would recommend knowing would be Gustave Courbet. This is actually Young Ladies of the Village. To the left is a poor girl begging for money, and you can tell by the way she's dressed. And to the right are middle-class women. And then Francois Millet in The Simple Walk to Work. Most of the art was very simplistic, reflected once again everyday life, sometimes the tragedies, the injustice, for example, in Young Ladies of the Village, or just the hard work and walk to work. Another important development during this time period were the ideas of Charles Darwin and the new science. And Darwin really revolutionized Western conceptions of science when he published his Origin of the Species in 1859. This theory of natural selection was that the development of humans from simpler organisms through a process of dynamic competition, essentially the ideas of survival of the fittest. This became the basis of evolutionary theory, and of course was in great conflict with the churches in Europe and in North America as well. Um, Ultimately, we're going to see, some churches accept some elements of Darwinism, others will not, and the theory is still hotly debated even today. More important for history were the ideas, how his ideas were, applied to economics, politics, and social organization, and what became known as social Darwinism. The leader of the movement of social Darwinist ideas was Herbert Spencer, and the ideas basically took this idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to social organization, applied it to economics. And for the most part, especially in Europe, we're going to see combined with nationalism this idea of social Darwinism that some races or ethnicities were superior to others is going to legitimize prejudices and legitimize, maltreatment of people. As a result, we'll see an increase in anti-Semitism during the late 19th century. We'll see an increase in uh, prejudice against non-Europeans. Social Darwinism will justify the colonization of both Africa and Asia and the subjugation of African and Asians. And this will continue really through the Holocaust of the 20th century. The final development I wanted to talk about during the 19th century was the revolution in healthcare. And what we're going to see with healthcare is just improved standards of living. We already discussed in class how the Crimean War led to some changes in healthcare and during warfare, and we'll see that continue. Louis Pasteur's example, the process of pasteurization, removing bacteria from products, will help to, lead to more improved food sources. Joseph Lister, who will invent an antiseptic, will lead to better practice with surgery. We'll also see the use of anesthesia during the time. And the results of all of these changes in healthcare will be people living longer. Combine that with the fact that more food is going to come to the diets of ordinary Europeans by the late 1800s, and lifespans will greatly increase, child mortality rates will go down, and we'll see a general improvement even in the working class standard of living. That is all for today. Once again, I just want to remind you to study for your tests. Your test will still be on Monday. We're going to cancel the LAQ for this unit, so there's some good out of watching this. Take care and make sure to study.